Let's start that again. Good afternoon, everybody. A warm welcome to the third day of PAFA's Sustainability Week under the overarching theme Pathways to Prosperity, Advancing Sustainable Development in Africa. My name is Lebogang Sene, and I will be kind of your MC for the day. So for those that have been with us since Monday, I trust that you have found the discussions from the first 2 days to not only be insightful, but inspiring as we've delved into the critical issues surrounding sustainability development and sustainability reporting in both the public and private sector. As a brief recap, we kicked off the week by exploring the role of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards in driving African economic growth, fostering investment, and supporting the transition to a more sustainable, prosperous Africa, and had an opportunity to dive deeper into both IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. Yesterday, under the sub-theme Greening Government, Navigating the Path to Sustainable Public Sector Practices, we delved into the significant role of the public sector in leading by example when it comes to sustainability practices. Our deliberations shed light on the topics of green finance and funding of government projects, the role of public-private partnerships in responding to climate change, as well as the work of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board, the IPSASB, in advancing public sector sustainability reporting. Today, we're switching gears a little bit, but not our commitment to advancing sustainability in Africa. Our theme for today is building trust, the power of sustainability assurance. In our journey towards prosperity and sustainable development, trust is the currency we cannot do without. As we witnessed in the previous days, sustainability reporting has gained considerable importance in the public and private sector. However, promises alone are not enough. We need mechanisms to ensure that these promises are kept, that commitments to sustainability are honored, and that transparency and accountability are at the forefront of our actions. This is where sustainability assurance comes into play. It is the bridge between intention and reality, between commitment and action. In the private sector, companies are under increasing pressure to demonstrate their commitment to sustainability, not just through words, but through verifiable action. Sustainability assurance helps them build and maintain trust with their customers, shareholders, and the wider community. In the public sector, governments must uphold their commitment to sustainable development, not only for the benefit of current citizens, but for the well-being of generations to come. Sustainability assurance reinforces the credibility and transparency of government efforts. During today's session, Mr. David Madden, Director at the International Federation of Accountants, will paint a picture of the state of play in sustainability reporting and assurance, both globally and in Africa. Following his presentation, Mr. Warren Maroon and Ms. Elizabeth Strike-Sanchez of the IWSB, both board members, will take us through the currently open IWSB exposure draft, proposed international standards on sustainability assurance 5000, or ISSA 5000 for short. I cannot overemphasize how important it is that we hear your views in the proposals made in this exposure draft. So if nothing else, please, please, please provide your feedback to just that when we engage today. I extend our heartfelt appreciation to our speakers and all of you who have joined us on this important journey towards a more sustainable and prosperous Africa. Together, we will pave the way for the continent's brighter and more sustainable future. So with those words, I welcome you, and I also just encourage you to, if you haven't been with us, refer to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have questions for our presenters as we go through. And of course, I see a lot of you have already started doing that. Use the chat function to introduce yourself and let us know where you're coming from. A final point of the housekeeping, for those that may not be familiar, we do have interpretation in French, although Isabel is fluent in French, she's French speaking. So for our French delegates today, you literally have somebody who can speak to you directly and explain those technical nuances that don't always come through in these type of platforms. So with those words, I would like to hand over to Mr. David Madden for his presentation.
Well, hello, Libo, and thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I am truly honored to again be included in one of PAFA's Sustainability Week, especially on Assurance Day. As you know, there is a path emerging in Africa with Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Kenya announcing for ISSB standards. And we hope that this will also be the case as more reporting takes place for the evolution of sustainability assurance in Africa as well, using the IAASB's new standard, ISA 5000. So as Level said, today I will provide some global perspective, but I will also try to offer some insights into the state of play, specifically in 5 African countries that are covered by our research. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I hope and believe that most of you are already familiar with IFAC's work in this space, but let me just introduce the State of Play series. This has been a 3-year initiative to examine both reporting and assurance sustainability information by the largest stock exchange listed companies across the G20 plus Singapore and Hong Kong. I would say just last month, but actually it was 2 months ago now, in September, we published a new report that expands the scope of this research to include 20 additional jurisdictions, and we tried to focus primarily on the global south. So the new work includes Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, and Nigeria, in addition to South Africa, which was in our original G20 project. And then earlier this summer, we took a deep dive look at 900 assurance reports to really understand the who, what, and how of sustainability assurance. So our research now encompasses nearly 2,000 companies in 42 countries, and I'll draw on all 3 of these studies today in my remarks. Next slide, please. So here's our G20 plus Singapore and Hong Kong scorecard. While we find that 95% of companies in our sample reported some information, even if it was just one greenhouse gas metric in their 2021 disclosures, assurance lags reporting. But there is a clear upward trend from 51% in 2019 to 64% in 2021. Assurance is limited in nature, consistently around 80% of the time. Audit firms conducted 57% of ESG assurance engagements globally in 2021, but that means 43% of engagements were done outside the accountancy profession by consultants or other service providers. When accounting firms are engaged, they are overwhelmingly 95% of the time using IAASB standards, but other service providers use them less frequently, only 38% of the time. So I know that some of you have already seen these numbers, but this is a really good starting point for any discussion about sustainability reporting and assurance. Now, having expanded our research by another 20 jurisdictions, we can now look at data that includes 150 of the largest stock exchange listed companies in the 5 African countries that I just mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So this is what our State of Play Africa scorecard looks like. It shows an overall 85% rate of reporting. So that's 10% below the G20 level. The trend from 2019 to 2021 in reporting shows an increase of just 2%, which is just a few companies. So slow progress here. Assurance has been on a somewhat stronger upward trend, 5% over the last 3 years. But at 35% overall, the percentage of companies obtaining assurance over some of what they report from the African countries is almost half the rate of assurance in the G20. Like most regions in the world, assurance is limited in nature. 50% of engagements were being done by accountants. And interestingly, when consultants provided assurance, they are not using IAASB standards. Only 9% in our study used ISA 3000 revised. And you see that that number has been declining. Next slide, please. So let's take a closer look. We know that consistently applied standards and frameworks for how and what information is reported provides the best foundation and the suitable criteria for high quality and consistent assurance. However, when we examine the G20 or the 20 jurisdictions beyond the G20, we find the same thing. Most companies, in excess of 80% of companies, currently use a mix of standards and frameworks for their ESG reporting. So we don't believe current practice best supports the quality of sustainability information we think investors and all stakeholders want, nor does it support consistency of assurance and the consistency of assurance that audit firms can provide. And this is why mandatory reporting requirements like those of the ISSB are so important. So on this slide, we see that our 85% average reporting rate is really driven by Egypt. Otherwise, we'd be above 90% of companies reporting. But importantly, the companies we have reviewed are doing a good job of connecting their financial and sustainability information by presenting their ESG information in annual reports, that's reflected by the blue bars, or in integrated reports, which are shown in green. So reporting on sustainability is happening predominantly in annual reports in Morocco and Nigeria, and companies in Kenya and South Africa are relying on integrated reports. The top chart on this slide shows a 50% reduction in the use of standalone sustainability reports, that's the red bar, over the 3-year 2019 to 2021 period. Next slide, please. So, given the history of integrated reporting in Africa and the frequency of it that we are now seeing in Kenya, we thought it'd be interesting to share a couple of data points from our recent analysis of 216 reports from our 2021 state of play sample set that we found were preparing the reports consistent with the integrated reporting framework. These reports were taken from 6 jurisdictions where we find the most reference to the IR framework: Brazil, France, India, Japan, South Africa, and Turkey. The first observation here is that we find most companies use the IR framework in their upfront narrative disclosures, except in South Africa, where a separate integrated report is typically prepared. Second, I think one of the most important debates in sustainability standard setting is about materiality, which is one of the 7 guiding principles of the IR framework. In our comment letter to the ISSB's recent agenda consultation, we recommended that how companies explain their assessment of the significant factors that affect their ability to create value over time should best align with the definition of materiality in IFRS accounting standards as well as ISSB sustainability standards. But our research, we observed a wide range of materiality approaches, 7 in total, which are listed on the legend to this graph. So we infer from this that companies may be using results from their multi-stakeholder or GRI materiality assessments to determine what information to address in the integrated reporting portion of their disclosures. So South Africa is the outlier here, where the vast majority of companies refer to value in that materiality assessment. We think that means value as in value creation, which links to long-term performance and sustainable, resilient companies. So we believe and interpret that the approach South African companies are taking suggests a compatibility between the ISSB initiative and integrated reporting principles. All right, next slide, please. So getting back to our state of play research and turning our focus to assurance, we have a lot of information summarized here. As we saw earlier in our scorecard for Africa, 35% of companies obtained assurance over at least some of the ESG information they reported in 2021. That's a 5% increase from 2019. But this is really a story about South Africa, where the frequency of assurance is similar to other G20 average nations. In contrast, there's little or no assurance in Kenya or Morocco. So assurance is in the early stages of its evolution in Africa, at least in the countries we're reviewing. When we look at who is providing assurance in the center chart on this page, it's about a 50-50 split between accounting firms and consulting firms. But this too is a jurisdiction-specific story. In South Africa, there's been a dramatic rise in greenhouse gas verification. So we have seen over 2019 to 2021 an 18% increase in consultant market share. On the other hand, all assurance in Kenya was performed by audit firms, but all assurance in Egypt was performed by other service providers. So a final point is that consultancy work on assurance typically leads to more variability in the level of assurance being provided. It's still mostly limited on the graph on the right, but as we see, there has been some decline in South Africa, in Egypt, where we think consultants are active. So our IAASB colleagues are on screen, are going to be presenting later, but I have to take this opportunity to clearly state IFAC's point of view. Standard fragmentation in reporting requirements leads to unnecessary complexity, confusion, and cost for all stakeholders. The same is absolutely true for standard fragmentation in assurance standards. So we strongly urge all of us in the profession to engage and submit comments to the consultation on ISA 5000 so that it is a true globally successful standard, and that we must as a profession actively support and promote its adoption in Africa and around the world. So if I could have the next slide, please. So the switch from voluntary to mandatory assurance is an important transition with regulatory, investor protection, and public interest implications. So this year, we decided to look more closely at who is providing assurance, using what standards, and how different practitioners apply assurance standards like ISAE 3000 revised as a proxy for the possible and probable use of ISA 5000 in the future. So here's what our 2021 research found. Next slide, please. Accountancy firms use ISA 3000 95% of the time. Other service providers use it 38% of the time. I mentioned that in our global scorecard. Assurance reports from accounting firms stated that the engagement was conducted in accordance with ISA 3000 98% of the time versus 53% for assurance reports from consultants. A specific code or standard of ethics for independence was cited less than 1/3 of the time for other service providers, 93% by accountants. And quality controls were cited 38% of the time in the assurance reports we reviewed from other service providers versus 91% for firms. Next slide, please. So switching our attention to what types of engagements using what standards accounting firms and consulting firms provide. Focusing on Africa, we reviewed 150 companies. In 2021, 100% of the engagements we found from accounting firms use ISAE 3000. On the other hand, we found other service providers used a mix of standards, including most frequently ISO 14064. That was 48% of the time, and that's shown in red on the circle graph on the left. Then accountability, 26%, shown in purple, and ISAE 3000 only 9%, shown in blue. Over the 3 years, 2019 to 2021, there's been more than a doubling in the use of ISO, which is about practice in South Africa. Next slide, please. So finally, looking at the scope of assurance. We know from our G20 state of play research that just over half, 53% of companies who obtained assurance in 2021 did so on information that was disclosed in each of 4 categories: greenhouse gas information, other environmental information, social, and governance matters. 80% of accountancy firm engagements included 3 or 4 topics in this four topic category that I've set up here. Nearly 60% of other service provider engagements were limited to 1 topic, greenhouse gas related metrics, which is why ISO is popular in jurisdictions where consultants are doing assurance. So on the next slide, we have 4 key takeaways. Accounting firms rely on IAASB standards, while other service providers do use different standards for different types of engagements in different jurisdictions around the world. Virtually all accounting firm engagements are limited assurance, but other service providers provide a range of options. Range of opinions, sorry to misspeak. Firms tend to do broader scope sustainability, while consultants have specialized in greenhouse gas related engagements. And when we look specifically at ISAE 3000 engagements, we do see differences in how the standard is being applied. Next slide, please. So I'd like to conclude by highlighting 4 key challenges that IFAC has identified for professional accountants. We believe these must be met if our profession is going to rise to the opportunity that sustainability reporting and assurance offers. I've already covered in detail challenge number 4, being the preferred providers of high-quality assurance using ISO 5000 in conjunction with new requirements that IASBA is working on for ethics independence in sustainability assurance engagements. So let's look at block 1. Embracing the philosophy that challenge 1. Embracing the philosophy that sustainability starts inside of companies. So at IFAC, we call this an integrated mindset. Integrated mindset is an important starting point in sustainability disclosure because standards, GRI, ISSB, the ESRSs in the EU are all for companies who prepare information for stakeholders. And a central theme in integrated mindset is connectivity. Connecting sustainability expertise inside of a company with the finance and accounting expertise inside of a company so that sustainability and financial information are both used in decision-making by management, board oversight, risk and opportunity assessments, and in how companies choose to communicate with their stakeholders. The result is sustainability reporting, not as a regulatory compliance exercise, but as change management, as part of a sustainable transition. At IFAC, we believe that in the long run, companies that take an integrated mindset approach will have audit firms conduct combined financial audit and sustainability assurance engagements. So connectivity applies here as well. And this is where our profession brings expertise that other service providers do not. Challenge 2, global system. We need a harmonized global system for sustainability reporting. That's the long-term goal. I've already mentioned that our research shows over 80% of current reporting uses a combination of standard frameworks, including GRI, the SDGs, SASB standards, TCFD, etc. This is what needs to change. Voluntary reporting has taken us as far as we can. We need mandatory reporting in order to achieve consistent, comparable, decision-useful, investor-grade information. The building block or the two-perspective approach that starts with the investor-focused disclosure of the ISSB and can be complemented by impact-focused reporting like GRI or the SDGs. This is the right path for policymakers and regulators to pursue. Obviously, in Europe, the European Union has charted its own path. But as the ESRS were being finalized just a couple of months ago, the ISSB and EFRAG aligned on the same definition of financial materiality. The global system is going to be messy, and it's going to take time to evolve, but it's still the goal to the greatest extent possible. Final challenge, capacity building. Since the ISSB announced its partnership framework at COP27 last November, this has been a hot topic. So from a global accountancy profession perspective, here's how IFAC is thinking about it. First, and this is going to sound simplistic, we need awareness raising. We all need to come to a clear and common understanding of the importance and the need for mandatory reporting linked to the ISSBs based on the ISSB's global baseline to provide information for investors in capital markets. Understanding how ISSB, integrated reporting, GRI requirements all fit together is step 1. Otherwise, we don't know what we are building capacity towards. Number 2, education. This is obviously critical. Marrying our existing skills and competencies with new ESG knowledge. The goal is not to make all accountants into ESG experts, but to raise our general knowledge level so that we can effectively work with experts. IFAC's education panel is conducting research to determine whether the international education standards are fit for purpose or need to be amended or enhanced or supplemented to properly address sustainability. An important element of this engagement process has been identifying 4 sustainability competency focus areas that I really believe will help guide our profession in how we think about ESG upskilling, leveraging what we already know and applying it in new and different ways. Expect more from IFAC and our education team in the coming weeks on this. And IFAC is also encouraging our largest member bodies and the accountancy firms to lead on education and upskilling. As a profession, we must collaborate because we cannot afford to reinvent the sustainability education wheel 200 times around the world. Number three, from our perspective, is research. In order to expand the scope of dialogue about where we are and where we want to get to, IFAC has conducted a lot of research, the highlights of which I've presented here today. Data and research facilitates conversations about disclosure, assurance, governance, and regulation, and it provides the metrics for tracking progress in the years ahead. So we encourage PAOs to take up local research projects in their home jurisdictions. Fourth element of capacity building circles all the way back to integrated mindset. We need to focus on companies, making sure they are getting prepared to implement new standards, be they from the ISSB or from EFRAG. PAOs and PIB members, PAOs with PIB membership really need to be on message on this point. But accountancy firms who do advisory work for companies must also do the same. So I've tried to present these four challenges as a bit of a call to action for all of us in the profession. If we meet them, then we can be the enablers of the sustainable transition. IFAC strongly believes that a global system for sustainability disclosure must be founded on the ISSB baseline, investor-focused requirements, coupled with the IAASB's global baseline standard for assurance, and supported by ethics and independence from practitioners following the soon-to-be expanded ISBA code. So the decision to transition from voluntary to mandatory requirements is a significant step that requires important jurisdiction-specific decisions to be made. We hope our research is helpful for those regulators and policymakers, the standard setters, and all assurance practitioners about current global trends and current market practice and where we want to get to. So with that, I say thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, I think if there's anything that I've taken away is that we need to end fragmentation. So we've got seven questions on our Q&A box, or there may all be comments. Let me just go through those. Wow, I think there may all be comments. Just to answer the person who asked about Slido, we are not using Slido today. But maybe just to encourage people to use the Q&A this time, we are using Q&A, and to rather use the chat to let us know who you are, do your greetings, and just where you're from. Maybe I'll just read the comments that are online before we move on to the next presentation if there are no questions for David. And an anonymous attendee says, sustainability is the future of the professional. To what that's a question. To what extent does the member of the professional take a lead on this subject matter? I don't know, David, I think you've already articulated that, but if you want to reiterate how the profession can take a lead, I think that was your last slide in many ways.
Yeah, I really think those four challenges are worth taking a second look at. And, clearly upskilling in our ESG knowledge to make us more conversant, just like we have in many other topics, is a key opportunity, should be an exciting opportunity, but yes, a challenge for each of us as professional accountants. But I also want to emphasize, it's a bit of a catchphrase that IFAC has, I don't know that accountants are going to save the world. That may not be a popular thing to say in Professor King's part of the world, but I'm confident that sustainable transition is not going to happen without the accountancy profession. We are the enablers that are in the middle of information flows, decision-making processes, systems and controls inside of companies. Sustainability starts inside of companies, and we're going to be at the center of that transition that happens inside of companies. And there's one other comment in the chat that I just wanted to make reference to. It mentions the words public interest. And as we are turning the baton over to our IAASB colleagues, it's really important to understand that IAASB standards are set in the public interest. with a global governance and oversight structure that is unlike anything that any other sustainability standard setting process does. And those monitoring group reforms and governance reforms that oversee the work of the IAASB as well as IASBA, I think are really critical factors for policymakers and regulators to take into account as they're making the decision about which standards should be applied for ethics and assurance engagements in sustainability.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, David. Truly appreciated. I think perhaps then, without much further ado, if there are no questions, I'm going to give it one last chance for anybody to ask their questions. If there are no questions for David, I will release him. Although, David, are you able to stay with us for the remainder of the session?
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. Is it my connection that is now failing me? David, did you get that? Are you able to stay with us?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay. So talking about standard fragmentation and addressing that fragmentation from the perspective of the assurance standards, it is my pleasure to hand over to our esteemed colleagues from the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board, who will take you through their work in the space of sustainability assurance. I'm just about to share that screen over to you, Isabel and Warren.
Lebo, thank you very much. If you can just confirm that you can hear me. I'm seeing yes. Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation. Isabel and I are delighted to come and chat to you about ISA 5000. And as always, David, it's a pleasure to come and talk about 5000 after you've given your superb summary of the state of integrated and sustainability reporting and the development of assurance. From an academic background, it's always great to sort of see this kind of research that gives us a sense of how the market is progressing. And of course, my own biases as a South African come through. I love to sort of see those graphs showing that South Africa is making an important contribution to the sustainability reporting space, but also fantastic to see that Africa as a whole is starting to sort of embrace this idea of sustainability reporting and starting to experiment with the assurance of sustainability reporting. And it's really in that spirit that Isabel and I are here to talk to you all today about the importance of getting Africa's perspective on 5000. I'm inviting all of you to participate in our exposure draft and to provide Isabel and I with feedback if you don't necessarily think that you'll be able to get around to writing a detailed response letter. So we have a fairly detailed set of points to discuss on our next slide, please, where we'll be going and having a look at the main aspects of 5000 and talking about the sort of the importance of sustainability and sustainability assurance, building on what David has spoken about, some key concepts, principles, and definitions. We'll move on to materiality, risk, and response. We'll touch on misstatements, the process by which we evaluate other information, and then communicate and report to those charged with governance and respective users. And we'll touch briefly also on some global developments and our broader outreach plan. Isabel and I are going to sort of be interchanging between the slides as we work through today's presentation. It is a fairly lengthy one, so we'll be stopping at regular points to get feedback rather than just sort of taking questions at the end of the process. If we can move to the next slide. So really, if we actually think about sustainability assurance, it really builds on David's point. One of the key risks, which I also think is a serious problem as far as the broader extra financial reporting environment is concerned, is a fragmented reporting frameworks. The fact that we are all using different reporting frameworks adds to that complexity, as David pointed out. And if we get into a situation where we have a fragmented assurance environment, that just amplifies the effects of all of that complexity. So it's in that spirit that ISA 5000 applicable, which is context specific, and which is at the same time scalable. So a very tall order, which Isabel and I hope you will agree we've met the brief. But before we get into all of the details on sustainability assurance, since it is Assurance Week, I thought it was appropriate to approach the presentation by applying some professional skepticism and trying to make the case that there is in actual fact sufficient appropriate evidence that assurance matters. That it's not really just an exercise in greenwashing or an exercise in political correctness or, the flavor of the month. We should all have a sustainability report and have it assured. We think that there's very good empirical evidence to support the importance of assurance in a sustainability reporting context. And the first piece of evidence which I've picked up on is exactly what David was talking about: the proliferation of both sustainability reporting and assurance internationally and globally. Because the simple reality is that preparing a sustainability report and having that report assured costs money. And the more organizations are engaged in reporting and assurance, the more likely it is that it's not just a case of impression management, because it's unlikely that organizations would incur that kind of expenditure to yield a cheap marketing benefit. But you might say that only gives us a limited level of assurance. It doesn't give us sufficient appropriate evidence to say that assurance actually matters. And so we go to sort of the next stage of saying, well, if we are thinking about sustainability assurance and the importance of sustainability assurance, yes, the GRI and standards like ISAE 3000 remain dominant. And yes, we know that the ISB has released its standards that are building on the work of TCFB and SASB. But when we look at all of that holistically and we look to the academic research, what we see is that companies which are using these different sustainability reporting frameworks, whether it be GRI or ISSB or TCFD or national jurisdiction equivalents, we see a reduction in information asymmetry. We see reduced costs of capital. We see reduced costs of debt. We see improved analyst forecast accuracies. We see pretty strong evidence that sustainability reporting matters. Pretty good empirical evidence that sustainability reporting is informing capital market decisions. And lo and behold, when you superimpose assurance on top of those relationships, the effects are amplified. And very importantly, this data is coming from a whole host of jurisdictions, from a whole host of academics, working with different methods, different measures for different proxy variables, reaching more or less the same conclusions. And now we start to see that assurance probably is giving us value-generating activity, to use the terminology very broadly. And so we're starting to get towards that reasonable assurance level to support Isabel and my proposition that assurance actually matters. But the final observation that I want to bring to your attention is not only those jurisdiction-specific developments and this idea of creating a global baseline, but actually narrowing the analysis in, rather than looking at the macro level and going and selecting samples of companies and engaging with them directly to understand their assurance practices. And when academics like me go and conduct these studies and interact with these companies and conduct detailed interviews, very similar, I suppose, to what a traditional assurance provider would do, we start to find evidence of companies with more robust systems of internal control. We start to find evidence of companies which, as David pointed out, are beginning to formalize their data collection and analysis. They are collecting information on the E, the S, and the G. And they're doing that in a more sophisticated way than just a mad rush to get a spreadsheet together in time for the reporting cycle. They've actually got databases where they house this information and they're processing that information to inform their internal decision-making. So David, hopefully that's music to your ears. And it is, as a general rule, more likely that companies are doing this when there is an external assurance provider. And when we take those three pieces of information together, the proliferation of ESG assurance, which David referred to in his presentation, the academic work on the empirical link between assurance and direct market value, and the academic work on the systems, the processes, the accounting infrastructure benefits which assurance provides, I think we have pretty good evidence to make the assertion that assurance matters. And to sort of put the cherry on the top, none of the information from this slide and none of the research findings which I am presenting come from the IAASB or IFAC, or were even funded by the IAASB or IFAC. So complete independence then from a group of experts working quietly in the background, confirming that assurance actually matters. And it's on that note that Isabel and I want to start getting into the details of unpacking an assurance solution, which we hope will capitalize on what we already know about ESG assurance and allow us to take this assurance market forward, working towards that standardized, consistent global baseline approach, which both the IAASB and IFAC are advocating. Can I have the next slide, please? So the aim is pretty simple. We want to develop a standard which provides an overarching principles-based framework for assuring ESG information. And for brevity, we'll just be talking about sustainability assurance. We've used ISAE 3000 and 3410 as the foundation, and we've done that for a variety of reasons. We are very aware of the fact that we need to prevent that fragmentation which David was talking about in his presentation. We need an assurance solution yesterday, not in 10 years' time. And so we thought that the best place to start was to use a well-established framework like 3000. And that's not just about being biased. Again, it's backed up by empirics. As David eloquently pointed out, 3000 is widely used in a whole host of jurisdictions by both auditors and other assurance providers. It gives us a type of base language that we can use to describe ESG assurance or sustainability assurance and enable the uptake of this assurance in different jurisdictions and by different practitioners. Now, as a principles-based standard, we're very mindful of the fact that ISA 5000 doesn't go into a tremendous amount of detail on every topic or every issue. And that's why we've kept a space open on possible future projects, thinking about areas where we might be able to respond to emerging issues as they arise, as people have had an opportunity to experiment with the implementation of ISA 5000, as a possible way forward, developing additional standards, additional guidance, additional non-authoritative material, which can be used to facilitate the rapid expansion of ESG assurance in different contexts and in different markets. Now, what I've said fits very neatly into a nice green bucket and a blue bucket on the slide, which you're currently looking at, but that's a lot more difficult to achieve than just talking about it. And so Isabel and I would like to now go into a little bit more detail, taking you through some of the key features of ISA 5000, which we hope achieve these overarching objectives: that global baseline, a core assurance solution, which is readily implementable in a whole host of different contexts. If I can have the next slide, please. So let's unpack the objective of 5000 in a little bit more detail, just in case you weren't convinced that it was a tall order. We believe that 5000 should be applicable to all sustainability topics and to all information disclosed about those topics. To put it in simple English, ISA 5000 should cover the E, the S, and the G, as opposed to just focusing on a specific issue like greenhouse gas emissions. That's not to say that greenhouse gas emissions are unimportant. They are important. But there are other aspects in addition to greenhouse gas emissions which form part of this much broader sustainability puzzle. And ISA 5000 needs to be broad enough to deal with all of them. The standard should be able to cover all reporting mechanisms. Again, as David pointed out, different countries like to house their sustainability information in slightly different formats. Some people, like us in South Africa, like to prepare integrated reports. Others choose to refer to an annual report or a sustainability report or a corporate social report or a responsibility report. There are hundreds of different names for all of these sustainability reporting platforms. And we want ISA 5000 to be applicable to all of them. And not only that, we want the standard to be applied irrespective of the reporting framework which you've used. So whether you're using the GRI, or the IIRC, or the European standards, or some type of combination, 5000 should be an applicable solution. And 5000 should apply to all users and stakeholders. And that means that it applies irrespective of whether you're using a double materiality logic to prepare your sustainability report, or a single or impact or financial materiality logic to prepare your sustainability report. So 5,000 should be applicable. The standard is designed to cater for limited and reasonable assurance engagements, and it's designed to be used by accountants and non-accountants because, again, as David has shown us, there are a whole host of different players in this assurance market. The IAASB is not trying to advocate for the dominance of one group over another, so the standard should be capable of being used by all professionals who adhere to a suitable ethical framework and strict quality control processes, like those that we see in terms of the ISPA code and ISQM1. If I can have the next slide, please. So with that sort of very broad overarching framework in place, let's have a look at some of the key principles and concepts just to try and get our heads around how ISA 5000 would work. We start off with the bits in blue, the sustainability matters, a bit of a tongue twister there. For those of you that are very familiar with 3000, these sustainability matters are the equivalent of our subject matter in terms of 3000. And we can think of them as topics and aspects of topics. That's just a fancy way of saying that we can break our sustainability information or content down into different themes. We can have climate, labor, or biodiversity as topics or themes that might be covered by the sustainability report. And we can decompose or disaggregate those themes further. So, for example, if we're going to talk about climate, the topic, we could talk about the risks and opportunities linked to climate. So if those of you that are advocates of the TCFD, you'll see a clear connection here. You've got your climate, and then you unpack that. What are my risks and opportunities? What are my governance issues? What are my key performance issues? Similar logic can apply to the use of GRI with something like child labor. You can decompose it down into its different aspects to help get your head around the particular topic. Now, these topics and aspects of topics can have different characteristics. They could be qualitative or quantitative, historical or forward-looking, involving judgment to a whole host of different degrees. And so we say that there are a variety of different types of characteristics which apply. Now, if we hit on the next slide, we've got an opportunity to look at our frameworks and our entity-developed criteria. In other words, internal and external criteria. Depending on the jurisdiction in which you're located, depending on how sophisticated the reporting environment is, it's possible that an external framework may not give you enough to prepare the sustainability information, the green box in the middle. And so we might need to complement those frameworks with entity-developed criteria. In my mind, I like to think of those entity-developed criteria as the equivalent of accounting policies in financial statements. They help us take the core principles in the framework and develop something more granular, that we can think about the topics and the aspects of the topics in the context of the business model. So if we take those criteria and we apply them to the subject matters, we end up with the sustainability information, or in 3000 language, the subject matter information, and that basically gives us the disclosures about the topics. To put it very simply, the bits and bobs that actually end up in the sustainability report. And that gives us the sustainability information as a whole. Now, the sustainability information as a whole, which the auditor or assurance provider looks at, may not be the whole report. The organization needs to prepare the whole report, but the assurance provider might look at either the whole report or something less than the whole report. And the assurance provider is concerned with the assertions that management is making about the sustainability information. So that's auditing 101. You've got your sustainability information, and management asserts that it's accurate or complete or relevant or reliable and so on. And the objective of the assurance provider is simply to test those assertions in the context of materiality. Now here we're talking about the materiality which the assurance provider is using to evaluate those disclosures and decide if there are misstatements. And Isabel will go into that in more detail a bit later. But remember that the organization might have a double materiality or an impact materiality in play, and that will inform how the blue box and the green box are articulated by the entity, or to put it more simply, it's going to inform the base data that the auditor or assurance provider is going to be working with when trying to express an opinion on the sustainability information within the scope of the assurance engagement. Lebo, if you can hit for the next slide, please. So we end up then with assurance engagements, which, as I said, could cover the entire sustainability report or something less than the entire sustainability report, depending on the prevailing facts and circumstances, with a clear conclusion provided either in the positive or the negative, depending on whether it's limited or reasonable assurance. And again, Isabel will go into the reporting in more detail. As you'll hear from her, reporting is her baby. So I definitely don't intend to go into reporting at detail at this point. And we're simply making a note here that, yes, if you do have greenhouse gases involved as part of the sustainability report, 3410 is still in play. So for those of you that are deeply committed to 3410, please don't think we threw the baby out with the bathwater. It's still there in the background to help you work through greenhouse gas emissions as you tackle the sustainability assurance journey or adventure in more detail. So that gives us the broad outline. And on to the next slide. Hopefully I haven't put you to sleep or intimidated you with a whole host of unnecessary terminology. I think this is a good opportunity to pause and get any sort of observations, comments, or questions that you have on this sort of first part of our presentation. Lebo, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box.
I'm just looking at the Q&A. No, I think these are comments from earlier that are not necessarily related to your presentation, Warren. I'm wondering if we have a few minutes to see if our participants would like to maybe put up their hands and ask a question. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands.
Not a problem.
Sometimes
people need to get warmed up. And again, you know, as an
Absolutely.
academic, I'll tell you, if the lecture is of such a high quality, you just preempt all of the questions.
Precisely. All right.
All right, well, without delaying unnecessarily, I think let me hand over to Isabel. And Isabel is going to be taking us through a discussion on materiality, risk, and response. So I'll ask for the next slide. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Warren. The great thing when you work with an academic is that nobody can raise any question because it's so crystal clear. So I will do my best to reach that level. I'm more with practitioners background, and I will just say a few words in French. Bonjour à tous mes amis d'Afrique francophone. C'est un plaisir de vous retrouver ici pour parler du projet de normes d'assurance sur les informations de durabilité ISA 5000. Back to English, but with a French accent. So I will walk you through this part on materiality, risk, and response. That's really the heart of the assurance engagement. And the first thing which is really key is to clearly understand what does materiality mean. And when we refer to materiality in an assurance engagement, there are several ways of referring to materiality. We refer first, and that's what Warren has done in the big slide that was explaining all the key concepts. Materiality is part of the framework. So materiality is part of what we call the criteria in an assurance engagement. And so the criteria will tell to the preparer what kind of materiality they have to apply to determine on which topics, aspects of topics to report. So that's the preparer's materiality. But the materiality I want to cover with you right now, it's not the preparer's materiality that is in the framework, it's the practitioner's materiality, which means the materiality what we are going to apply to perform our engagement, to determine what is material and what is not, and that will allow us to build a conclusion or an opinion at the end of the engagement. So the practitioner's materiality. It's not easy to use all these materiality concepts. So in order to help you with that, you may have noticed that the IAASB last week has issued a frequently asked question staff paper to help you read ED ISA 5000, the exposure draft on ISA 5000, and walk through all this concept of preparer's materiality, practitioner's materiality, financial materiality, impact materiality, double materiality. So if you want to learn more about that, please refer to this Q&A so FAQ that has been issued last week. But let's try to understand together what is materiality seen from the practitioners. One of the first challenge, and I will start by the jigsaw picture in blue in the middle, is that when you refer to materiality on financial statements, usually you're able to determine materiality on the financial statements taken as a whole, because everything is expressed in the same currency. And at the end of the day, you may be able to take a percentage of a financial indicator, for example, 5% of pre-tax income, and apply it on the financial statement as a whole, and it will work. When you enter into the sustainability world, you can normally never apply a materiality determination on the sustainability information, so SI on the slide, as a whole, but you need to look at each disclosure, and at the level of each disclosure, determine or consider materiality. And that's one of the challenge, because we're used to have one figure for materiality, but when we perform a sustainability assurance engagement, we may have many different materialities depending on the disclosure. And then at the IAASB, we had to decide which term to use for materiality. So if you are familiar with the ISAs in the International Standards on Auditing, we determine materiality because we end with a figure. When we were in 3000, we were considering materiality because 3000 could apply to anything. It could apply to financial information, but it could apply to procedures, it could apply to qualitative information. So the word that was used in 3000 was consider. And in 3410, the assurance standard on greenhouse gas, we had determined materiality. Because when you work on greenhouse gas information, it's quantitative, so you can determine a figure. So taking that into consideration, we decided to use the following. When you have a qualitative disclosure, a narrative disclosure, then you cannot end with a figure for materiality. So then what you need to do is use your mind and think about it. And the word we use in the international standards to mean use your mind and think about it is consider. So when it's qualitative, you will consider materiality. When it's quantitative, you will be like in an audit. You will be like in an assurance on a greenhouse gas statement. So then you will be able to determine materiality. And when it's quantitative, you will also have to deal with the aggregation risk, like in an audit. And what do you do in an audit to deal with aggregation risk? You determine performance materiality for that. So in ISA 5000, when you are dealing with quantitative disclosure, you will also be required to determine performance materiality. So that may seem easy, but what we have all to keep in mind is that determining or considering materiality is a matter of professional judgment. So there will never be one rule or one requirement that will fit to all situations. You will always have to use your brain, use your professional judgment, and document. That's the key. Document your materiality consideration or determination. So that was an important first step, materiality. Then we can move to the understanding of the entity, which is another very important step to properly scope the engagement. So what do you need to understand to properly plan your engagement? Whether you are in a limited assurance engagement or in a reasonable assurance engagement, so limited is L on the slide and reasonable is R on the slide, whether you are in one or the other, what you need to understand is three things: the entity and its environment, the applicable criteria, and the system of internal control of the entity. And we will focus on that. So in both instances, you need to understand these three things. But depending on whether you are in a limited or in a reasonable assurance engagement, you will not do the same procedures to get this understanding, and you will not have the same objective of doing these procedures. If you are in a limited assurance engagement, which is on the right on the slide in blue, as you can see with the balance, on a limited assurance engagement, it's lighter. So that's why it's higher on the balance. It's lighter because you will have to identify disclosures in the sustainability information where material misstatements are likely to arise. That's your goal. And when you will have identified these disclosures, then you will be able to design procedures to focus on these disclosures. Will be much heavier. And what the ask is exactly like in an audit. You will be asked to identify and assess the risk of material misstatement. ROMM on the slide means risk of material misstatement. And you will be required, like in an audit, to do that at the assertion level for the disclosures. And having done that, you will then be able to design further audit procedures that you're going to perform. So now let's move to the next slide and see what we need to understand when we have a look at internal control. So if we can move to the next slide. And we will have a look at the components of internal control. So you're probably familiar with these components of internal control. They are the ones that are used in COSO. So you have the control environment, the information system, the entity's risk assessment process, control activities, and last but not least, the entity's process to monitor the system of internal control. And then we had to decide at the IAASB what was the work effort that was needed in a limited assurance engagement and in a reasonable assurance engagement for each of these components of internal control. For reasonable assurance engagement, we already know what we do in an audit. What do we do in an audit? In an audit, we are required to understand and evaluate the 5 components of internal control. So you see the tick marks in the right column. If you are in a reasonable assurance engagement on sustainability information, you are required to understand and evaluate the 5 components. And then the challenge for the IAASB was to try to find the right balance for what we need to do in a limited assurance engagement. Keeping in mind what we have covered in the previous slide, which means that the objective is not the same in a limited assurance engagement compared to a reasonable assurance engagement. So we ended with this solution, which is proposed in the exposure draft of ISA 5000. We considered that you always need to understand the control environment and the information system in all instances, even for a limited assurance engagement. For the next 2 components, the entity's risk assessment process, we said, yes, that's something we need to understand, but not all the process, only the results of the process. For the control activities, we said, yes, maybe you need to understand the control activities. It depends how much you want to use that. And we ended by saying that you don't need, in a limited assurance engagement, to get an understanding of the entity's process to monitor the system of internal control. So, of course, when you will read the draft standard, you will see that for reasonable assurance engagement, you have much more detailed requirements. It's much more granular than for limited assurance engagement. And also, you will find much more application material in the draft standard on each component. And we brought material back from ISA 315, the last revised one, in order to support this part of the standard. So that was for the understanding of the internal control. Then the next step now is to have a look at the further procedures that we will perform. Again, we have to look differently on what we do on a limited and what we do in reasonable assurance engagement. And again, we will do much less in a limited assurance engagement than in a reasonable assurance engagement, because again, the objective is different. So the objective being for a limited assurance engagement that you will focus on disclosures where material misstatements are likely to arise. So in a limited assurance engagement, you're going to define the NTE on the slide, nature, timing, and extent of the procedures, keeping in mind this objective. If you're in a reasonable assurance engagement, the right column, then the nature, timing, and extent will have to be responsive to the risk of material misstatement that you have determined, and that has to be determined at the assertion level. So it's much more granular. What is similar is that you're never required to perform test of controls. Whether you're in the limited assurance column or in the reasonable assurance one, you will only perform test of controls if you want to obtain evidence about the operating effectiveness of the control. So that's important. And then you will perform substantive procedures. And of course, depending on whether you are in limited or reasonable assurance engagement, you will do probably more substantive procedure in a reasonable assurance engagement. On top of that, we have also defined overall responses that the practitioners need to do, and it's in specific situations. So you find on the slides more detail on what are these specific situations, but let me give you a few examples. But for example, if you have identified or suspected a fraud or a non-compliance with law and regulation, then you have additional overall responses to do. If you have identified some specific risks or some specific control deficiencies, you will also do more, and you will have more overall procedures to do. And if we move to the next slide, you may wonder why you can see someone diving in the water. Yes, it was on the next slide, please. Yes. So you have someone diving in the water, and it's stated that it is for limited assurance only. So it may remind you something that we discussed when we were presenting review and standards, that in a limited assurance engagement, we are requested to do, in some instances, what we call a deep dive. So that's why the person is diving. Deep dive means that if you believe that, if you become aware of something that causes you to believe that the sustainability information may be materially misstated, then you cannot stop there. You need to dive further until you reach the conclusion that either the matter is not likely to be misstated, or that the matter is misstated, and then you have to take the consequence. So in a limited assurance engagement, you may be required to perform many more procedures if you are aware of something that may cause you to believe that the sustainability information may be materially misstated. And then you cannot stop there again. you need to deep dive further until you reach a conclusion. And I want also to put a specific focus on the procedures that are required on some categories of disclosures. So if we may move to the next slide. So we also developed some specific requirements for estimates and forward-looking information. In sustainability information, we often find a lot of estimates, and we often find also a lot of forward-looking information because companies take commitments, for example, net zero commitments or other commitments, and they discuss what will occur in the future, and not only what is the historical situation. And then we had to develop procedures to deal with estimates and forward-looking information. If we look in the reasonable assurance column, you will probably recognize something you're already quite familiar with, because it's the requirements that you find in ISA 540 on estimates. And when you are in an audit and you have estimates, then you are required to do one or more of the following procedures. You can either or test how management developed the estimate, you can develop your own point estimate, or you can obtain evidence from events that have occurred up to the assurance report date. So that's what you're required to do in front of estimates and forward-looking information in reasonable assurance engagement. In limited assurance engagement, it's not as demanding because it's only limited assurance that we have to get. So in that case, what we are required to do is to evaluate the appropriateness of management application of the criteria, to evaluate appropriateness of method used to develop, estimate, and forward-looking information, and also check that it has been applied consistently, and also evaluate the appropriateness of changes that may have been performed from prior years, and also change from prior period. And then again, we need to determine if other procedures are necessary. So we'll think if something else needs to be performed on these estimates or forward-looking information. So as you can see, it's totally different. The work effort is totally different whether you are in the limited assurance camp or in the reasonable assurance camp. Let's now move to what we do on fraud and the need to maintain professional skepticism on the engagement. And here, there's no columns, only lines, because it's exactly the same mindset that you have to apply in a limited assurance engagement and in a reasonable assurance engagement. It's key, and it's part of all assurance standards, of course, that you maintain professional skepticism all over the engagement. And you are asked to design and perform procedures in an unbiased manner, and also to meet the intended purpose of performing this procedure. So again, whether you're in a limited or reasonable assurance engagement. But all over the standard, you will find requirements that deal with fraud and professional skepticism. So you will not find in the standard a specific place where you will find all these requirements. It's spread out all over the place in the standards. So it will require you to perform more procedures if you have doubts about the relevance and reliability of the information. It will ask you to evaluate whether the evidence you have obtained meets the intended purpose. It will also require you to respond appropriately when you have identified fraud or when there is a suspected fraud. And also it will require you to address inconsistent evidence and to respond to management bias. That's absolutely key. We are in an assurance standard, so professional skepticism is really the fishbone of this kind of engagement. And that's also absolutely key because we know that companies may be tempted to prepare fraudulent sustainability information. And part of this fraudulent sustainability information is sometimes called greenwashing, but fraud is not only greenwashing, there may be much more than that. But with all the outreach we are currently doing with the IAASB member, a lot of people discuss the risk of greenwashing and how we can perform procedures in order to properly deal with this risk and also identify potential fraud or greenwashing. So that's what you will find in the standard, and you can have a look at it. And when you will answer to the IAASB, you can also have a specific focus on that, because it's absolutely key that we have it right, because we know that fraud risk is not only in the financial statements, it's more and more also in sustainability information, because investors care more and more about sustainability information. So that having been said, I may probably pause at this point, and with Warren, we will take your comments on this heart of the engine of the sustainability assurance engagement.
Thanks, Isabel. I think I only saw one fairly general question that basically asks whether these standards would be compulsory for small entities, and also if this would not increase the cost, especially in Africa.
So that's a good question. Currently, the IAASB is organizing a lot of roundtables around the world together with IOSCO, and IOSCO is strongly encouraging their members to adopt, on one hand, ISSB reporting standards, and on the other hand, ISA 5000. And we see some countries that have already announced that they will mandate ISA 5000 when it will be final. Maybe you have seen the IAASB has announced yesterday that Brazil has said that they will adopt ISSB standard for listed entities and also require ISA 5000. What I've seen so far is that in most of the jurisdictions, the one that mandates sustainability reporting and sustainability assurance are often in the scope of listed companies or big groups. It's often not for small companies, but still the standard will be available for everybody, even if it's not mandated. I want to insist on the fact that this standard, this new ISA, International Standard on Sustainability Assurance, is, as all IAASB standard, a principle-based standard. So it means that a principle-based standard is able to be scalable to all size of entity and all complexity. So yes, it can be scaled down, but again, very happy to have your feedback when you will read the exposure draft, if you believe that it's sufficiently scalable and if something can be done to help that. I also want to mention that the IAASB has prepared 2 years ago a document which is called CUSP, which stands for Complexity, Understandability, Scalability, and Proportionality. And this document explains in detail how to deal with scalability in a standard. This document was developed to be used to develop ISAs, International Standards on Auditing. But when developing ISA 5000, the IAASB has also looked at this CUSP document to try to follow as much as possible these guidelines in order to embed some scalability and also to use some vocabulary that allows scalability. So happy to hear your feedback on that. But to the best of my knowledge, the IAASB is not planning to issue an ISA 5000 for less complex entity. So we have to have it right in ISA 5000 for the standard to be scalable.
Thanks,
Lebo, do we have any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Am I audible? Have I lost connectivity?
I can hear you.
I can
Okay.
hear you.
Thanks, Alta. There's 2 more questions. If we can maybe just address those before you move on to the next part of your session. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So the next question asks for clarity or further for you to further elaborate on impact materiality and ask specifically, will the firm by itself assess the impact in light of its operation alone, or should they consider the impact to the external party? And will there be any guidelines to follow on this? And then perhaps let me ask the other question so that we can take both of them at the same time. This one says, we've just completed the final standards on LCEs. Why has the board not considered running 2 parallel EDs to address sustainability audits for less complex entities? It would have been nice to finalize both at the same time. Some less complex entities may choose to voluntarily adopt sustainability reporting to gain access to global markets. The full scope audit procedures for a reasonable assurance engagement may be highly prohibitive. So I will decide, I'll let you and Warren decide who's going to take those 2
No,
questions.
I can start by the last one because I tried to answer to it at the end of my previous answer. So why has the board not run 2 projects in parallel? It's always a challenge to run 2 projects in parallel on the same topic because you have to run from one to the other. But more than that, it's because we tried to have the standard as scalable as possible. And so it's the right time if you believe that some procedures are too demanding. In many jurisdictions in the world, and I think David mentioned it, the ask, at least in the first stage, is to have limited assurance. So reasonable assurance is not what is commonly asked for. What we understand is that in many jurisdictions, it will start by limited and maybe move to reasonable assurance engagement, like in Europe, for example, or in Australia. But on the other hand, it's true that countries like India or Brazil, when it will become mandatory, will go to reasonable assurance. The idea is for reasonable assurance to have a real meaning. So there will not be a different level of reasonable assurance whether you are complex or less complex. Like in an ISA for LCE, you reach the same level of reasonable assurance applying ISA for LCE and applying the full set of ISAs. What would be interesting for the IAASB is to get your feedback on what you believe is not relevant for less complex entity, but keeping in mind that we should reach the same level of assurance. On the previous question that I may have lost, Lebo, could you remind me what was the previous question?
This is the one just asking about impact materiality and clarifying.
So impact materiality is a materiality that may be required by the criteria. So it's part of the practitioner's materiality. And the criteria that use the concept of impact materiality, like GRI or ESRS, they define it. So the IAASB will not define what is impact materiality. We have application material that refer to what is the concept of impact materiality, but it's up to the standard setter that define the reporting standards to clearly define what they expect to be performed and what is the meaning and extent of their definition of impact materiality. And then we have to assess as a practitioner the suitability of the criteria to see if the criteria is acceptable for us to perform our assurance engagement. But it's not up to the IAASB, being an assurance standard setter, to define what means impact materiality, because it may be different from one reporting standard setter to another.
Thanks, and then there's a question that is in French. I could try to read it, but let's not shock everybody. It's about the application of the standards.
In French, peut-on avoir l'état des lieux d'application des normes de durabilité dans le monde? So, is it possible to have a stocktake situation of how sustainability reporting standards are applied right now? So it's more a question for David. So I don't know, David, if you are still connected, if you want to provide a little bit more information. So who is applying GRI, who is applying SASB, TCFD?
Yeah, so hi, so I can chime in there. So whether we're looking across the G20 results that we have, or whether we're looking at the 20 jurisdictions beyond the G20, clearly GRI and the SDGs are the most commonly applied standard or framework that companies are using for reporting on. When we look at SASB versus TCFD application, there we see more of a bifurcation between the G20 countries and the beyond G20 countries. So I did not include GRI or SASB TCFD slides in my presentation, but on the SASB TCFD side, it's really South Africa where there's been a big increase in the use of both. And I think a sizable increase in Egypt as well, but you would have to characterize the application of SASB and TCFD standards or frameworks in the 5 African jurisdictions we look at is really nascent, really starting out. So the majority of African reporting we're seeing is GRI and SDG related. Just to dovetail that into our assurance conversation, when we look at, and this is a G20 analysis, not a broader analysis, when we look at the G20 and we look at where assurance is taking place, what is the standard or framework for the information that's reported that is most frequently being asserted and assurance is being provided over that information? And overwhelmingly, the answer is GRI related information. So it is among the most popular standards currently, and it is the information that is most commonly assured. 39% of the time, the information that we found assured was purported to be in accordance with GRI-related reporting. The second choice number was the greenhouse gas protocol. I don't remember what that percentage was, but importantly, and I don't want to say this in the wrong way, when we looked at information that was purported to be provided in compliance or in accordance with the SDGs, 1% of that information is assured. So I think that's a comment not about the value of the SDGs or the importance of the SDGs, but it's a comment about suitable criteria and the value of standards versus frameworks providing the suitable criteria for assurance engagements. So that's a little bit of background on SDG, GRI versus the others. But again, I think we have to remember, and now this is not an assurance comment, but a reporting comment, that what the ISSB is bringing to the table is information that will hopefully provide suitable criteria for an assurance engagement that is specifically investor focused. And what really is important here is to get the investor focused, capital markets focused information into the hands of investors so that capital flows can be directed in the right, most sustainable direction. And that is complementary to, not competing or contradictory to, the information that companies currently provide under GRI, for example.
Thanks, David. And back to you, Isabel. There are a few questions that I'll try and put together.
Yeah, but I can see that we have question on the evaluation of materiality, and that it's very subjective, and the fact that you used to have your mind, so it may lead to inconsistencies, and it may be also difficult. I think I read that when you have a new auditor coming in, because he may have a different assessment than the predecessor auditor, and all that is true. It's true, but on the other hand, to me, it's not new. Because you're already at this concept of consider materiality in ISA 3000, that is the most commonly used standard by the profession right now, as David has outlined it. So it is what it is, and yes, there will be a situation from where from one firm to another they will have a different appreciation of what is material. But this does exist also in the financial statement world, by the way. It's not only in the sustainability world, where different firms may have different assessment. But I acknowledge that, yes, it's much more complex. It's much more complex because it's not always a figure. It's much more complex because it's at the disclosure level and not at the level of sustainability information as a whole. So probably that we have to keep that in mind as practitioners when we assess the work effort that we need to apply on an assurance engagement on sustainability information, because this requires a lot of judgment. So this requires a lot of seniority. This requires a lot of thinking. And sustainability assurance engagements are not the kind of engagement that you can do in a few hours, unless it's very simple and you have only a single KPI. But if you have a full sustainability report of hundreds of pages with a lot of qualitative and quantitative disclosures on various topics, probably it will require a lot of seniority, a lot of partners' involvement, and a lot of thinking to properly assess materiality at each disclosure level and determine figures and consider what may be considered as material for qualitative information. So that's not something easy, but unfortunately, that's not something a standard can tackle. So I believe, Lebo, I've been much less clear than Warren because I've got a lot of questions.
Thanks, Isabel. And perhaps, David, can I ask you, there is a follow-up question, not for you to take it here, but I think it would be useful to maybe put in the chat a link to the various state of play reports that you have compiled that provides input on the state of sustainability assurance and reporting globally. So I don't know.
An interesting question that I have not answered yet, which is, will your standard include the concept of comply or explain, as it is the case with some governance code? And my answer is clearly no, because as for all IAASB standard, you have to comply. You cannot apply something based on ISA 3000 or based on 5000 or as adapted in the circumstances. To be able to claim compliance, you need to comply with everything. I know David, but in his state of play, has identified outside of the profession a lot of practitioners that claim compliance with ISA 3000, saying that it's based on or inspired by or whatever. but in the assurance standard setting world, you can claim compliance with a standard only if you have applied all the relevant provisions of the standard. And also, and it's underneath, but we are all aware of it, and it was mentioned by Warren, you need also to apply ethics and independence rules, at least as demanding as ISBA code. And you need to apply quality management standard, at least as demanding as ISQM1. So that's all prerequisite to claim compliance with ISA 5000.
Sorry, thanks, Isabel. I'm not sure if there's anything else. I don't see any other questions, so perhaps if there are more slides to get through, we can proceed.
So yes, maybe we can move to the last phase of the engagement, which is the identification of misstatements and the communication and the reporting phase. So if we move to next slide, you see on the left part the aggregation of misstatements, and you may identify misstatements at the level of a disclosure. So at each disclosure, you will have to determine if you found misstatements that are material, using the materiality determination or consideration we discussed previously. So in the example on the slide, you are performing procedures on the disclosure work-related injuries, and then you will be required to evaluate if individually and combined the effect of the misstatement you determined on that specific disclosure, work-related injuries, is material, and then you will have to take action. So either ask for modification of the disclosure, or if the disclosure is not modified, you will have a material misstatement on that disclosure. So that's the thing that has to be done at the lowest level. And then you have also to consider disclosures in aggregate. For example, there's a conclusion on occupational health and safety, and it includes work-related injuries. And then you will have to determine if in aggregate, this disclosure on occupational health and safety is materially misstated, taking into consideration the disclosure, the misstatement you identified at each disclosure being part of this disclosure in aggregate. And then you can also have situations where at each disclosure level, it's not material, but maybe at the end, you will consider that the sustainability information as a whole is misstated because it's all biased. So you will find in the standard also an application material paragraph on that, because sometimes every disclosure is biased. So even if it's not material at the level of each disclosure, you may end by having sustainability information that is misstated. So that's our traditional concept of misstatement that we apply at the level of each disclosure and at the level of disclosures in aggregate. But we also have another concept of disclosure, of misstatement, in the draft standard, which is misstatement in what we call the other information. So what is this other information? It's a term you probably have seen already, because this term is used in ISA 720, where we have a specific standard in an audit on what to do on other information. And in ISA 3000, we had already a requirement on other information, but it was not really developed, and it had not been updated at the time we revised ISA 720. So what we did in draft ISA 5000, we have further developed this concept of over-information and further developed the work effort to perform. So if you can stay on my slide, just yes, few minutes. So what are these over-information? So what is important is that the concept of over-information, it's information that is not subject to the assurance engagement. So it may be something that is not in the sustainability report you've been asked to assure. It may be something that is in the sustainability report, but you have not been asked to provide assurance over it. Let me take an example. You have a sustainability report with 50 disclosures, but you're asked to provide assurance only on 20 disclosures out of these 50. So the remaining 30 disclosures that are not in the scope of your assurance engagement, they are considered to be over-information. And this over-information, they are over-information if they are included in a document or documents that contain the sustainability information and the assurance report thereon. So let me take an example, the one I just provided. There's a sustainability report, 50 disclosures, you assure 20. The remaining 31, they are included in a document containing the sustainability information assured. So it's part of over-information. But let me take another example. If the sustainability report and the assurance report thereon is part of annual report. So in the annual report, you will find other chapter. And among the other chapter, you will find the financial statements, and you will find the audit report, and you will find a lot of other information in the annual report. So if the sustainability information and the assurance report thereon is included in the annual report, then all the other chapters of the annual report are considered to be other information. So as a practitioner, you will have to read the financial statement. If you are the financial statement auditor, that's not a big deal. You have done an audit of the financial statement. But if you are not the financial statements auditor, you will read these financial statements. And why will you read that? You will read that because there may be inconsistencies between the disclosures in the financial statements and the disclosure in the sustainability information. And what you don't want to do as an assurance practitioner, you don't want to be associated with misleading information. So you don't want to have your assurance report included in an annual report where information in one chapter is inconsistent with the information you have provided assurance. So that's the purpose of this part on over information. And something that is absolutely key is that, and it's a little bit different than what we have done in ISA 720, so that's why I want to put a spotlight on it. You will look at this over information only for the over information that is available at the date of the assurance report. So you're not going to chase additional publication that the company may make after the date of issuance of your assurance report. You will only read what is already available at the date of the assurance report and is going to be communicated together with the sustainability information. And now, last part of the engagement, and next slide, we will move to communication. So communication is first with who's charged with governance, and it's also in the assurance report. With who's charged with governance, we have a very high-level principle-based requirement to communicate significant matters to who's charged with governance. So, and we give examples. You may communicate, identify or suspected fraud or non-compliance with law and regulation. You may communicate, identify deficiencies in internal control. You may communicate management bias that you have identified. You may communicate uncorrected misstatements. But we don't have list of mandatory communication. We believed it was very difficult to have such a list because sustainability information may be one single KPI or a full sustainability report. It may deal with a single topic, GHG, or it may deal with 100 different topics. So it was very difficult to come with a fixed list of mandatory communication. So you will see that it's principle-based, and then we give example of what could be these significant matters. And finally, last but not least, the assurance report. So what have we done to develop the assurance report? We have looked at what we had in ISAE 3000 revised. We have looked at what we had in ISAE 3410. But even more than that, we looked at what we had in the so-called EER guidance. So it's a guidance that was published by the IWSB 3.5 years ago after 2 exposure drafts. And this is a guide on how to apply ISAE 3000 to sustainability information. It was non-authoritative, but there was a lot of good guidance. And among this very good guidance, you had report example. Because ISAE 3000, as you may all know, did not have any assurance report example. So we used the assurance report examples we had in this so-called EER guidance, and then we made some few changes. What we did, aligned with what we had in the EER guidance, was to put the practitioner's opinion, reasonable assurance engagement, or conclusion, limited assurance engagement, on the top of the audit report. So first paragraph, like in an audit report, like an executive summary, the first thing you want to read when you open an assurance report is what is the conclusion, what is the opinion. So it will come first. The other important change we made, and we made a parallel with what has been done in ISA 700 on assurance on audit report, we mandate the mention of the name of the engagement leader. That's how we call the engagement partner in ISA 5000, because we have to be profession agnostic, and some other practitioners not from the profession may not be partnership, so they may not have partners. So we call the person in charge of the engagement leader. And we say in ISA 5000 that in the assurance report for listed entities, you need to clearly put the name of the engagement leader. And last change we made when we developed this section that I just referred to on other information, we also developed the reporting part of it. You know, now in audit report, we have a part on other information. So similarly, in the assurance report over sustainability information, you have a section on the work you have done on other information. Of course, if there's no other information, you have no section. But if there are other information, then you have to deal with it in a specific section. And with that, I think I will pause here and take questions.
Thanks, Isabel. I only saw one question on the chat on the Q&A this time. And as I pull it out, give me a second. What does it mean when you say that every disclosure is biased? Can you clarify on this?
Yeah. So what I had in mind when I mentioned that, it's maybe that each disclosure in a sustainability report will be presented in a way that is more favorable than what it is in reality. So everything will look a little better than the reality. So maybe you will determine that at the level of its disclosure, the difference is not very significant, but at the end, you may conclude that overall, the picture that this sustainability report is providing on the entity is biased because everything is biased in the same direction to provide a more favorable picture. So that's what I meant when I mentioned that.
Thank you, Isabel. I know that you're going to be leaving us shortly. So I just wanted to just make sure that there isn't any other question. I don't see any other questions. For the individual, I didn't see your name, who asked, and it was in French, about the state of reporting or the standards that are being applied. We have pasted on the chat the various links to the studies that IFAC has conducted in this area. So please refer to those reports, the state of play reports. I don't see any other questions for you, Isabel.
Okay, so great. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. It was a pleasure to be with you today, and I let you with Warren till the end of the presentation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you too for joining us, Isabel. Truly appreciate it.
All right, so to wrap up then, really a broad overview of how 5000 operates. Isabel and I appreciate that the conversation has been very technical. There's probably a tremendous amount to absorb. So at this point, we wanted to just remind everybody that we're engaging in a whole host of global outreach events to give stakeholders an opportunity to interact, not only with Isabel and I, but with other members of the task force who have been working on the standard, and other board members as well. A whole battery of virtual awareness and information raising sessions. So I'll provide you with the link, Lebo. There's a particular dedicated web page which the IAASB has made available. And on that web page, you can find extracts from various presentations where we've worked through different parts of the standards. In case you'd like to listen to those again, it can often help inform the drafting of any comments you might have on the response letters. On the same web page, you'll also find a template which we've created to help facilitate preparing the response letter. Of course, people can draft their own response letter, but there's a template available and a short survey which people can use either in addition to the actual response letter, or perhaps in substitute if you don't have time to prepare a full response letter. We're really trying to create as many opportunities as possible for stakeholders to provide feedback on the standard, because we're committed to trying and wrapping up the standard as quickly as possible. We're not trying to cut corners, but we want a high quality solution which is operable and available for the marketplace as soon as possible. And again, it's just bringing it back to that point of wanting to avoid further fragmentation in the sustainability reporting and assurance space. We still have some global roundtable and events which are forthcoming, I think later in November, which will hopefully be included in an online platform, which delegates from Africa are welcome to attend, in addition to events which have been hosted by PAFA and SAICA as well down in South Africa. So really, I think those are just various opportunities. We've also included an email, which you'll find at the bottom of the slide, for any stakeholders to contact Michelle Harrison for any specific regional updates which you feel might be value adding depending on your respective jurisdiction. And then I believe we can move to the final slide where you'll find the usual bells and whistles with links to the different social media platforms and the IAASB webpage. And if you actually do click on that link, it will take you through to the dedicated webpage to which I was referring. So that really then wraps up the overview of 5000. I hope that everybody found that interesting and not too bewildering. And if there are any final questions on the standard, I think we've got a little bit of time left. I'm happy to take those questions. Lebo, I now hand over to you.
Thank you, Warren. We certainly do have quite a few minutes actually for our guests or our participants to ask their questions. I did see a comment in the chat where somebody said this is a lot of new information. So to your point, I think we can appreciate that it's been a lot, but a very informative discussion. I'm not seeing any questions specifically for you, Warren. And I'm wondering whether we have time to try and get some hands up. Any comments? Not seeing any hands, so I'm not going to drag it out. If we don't need to, let's give back the people. Let's give the people some time back. With that, I would then like to call on Admire Duranduru to give us some closing remarks before we close. And thank you, Warren, and everybody else really for making this time.
Thank you very much to you, Lebo, for facilitating such a high energy session. Thank you to David, Warren, and Isabella for the technical presentations. Participants, thank you very much for participating in the Sustainability Week being hosted by PAFA. I think those of us who have been here since Monday, you can see that the energy is increasing as the days go by. So a call has been made. We need to get Africa's voice heard in the finalization of the standard ISA 5000. Our call is for all participants through their home PAOs to work towards making input contributions so that we can have comment letters being submitted on the ED so that our views, our context is heard during the finalization of the standards. What I always say that as professionals on the continent, we should not be standard takers, but standard setters. We set standards through participation in the due process of coming up with standards. We need to appreciate PAFA for setting up this very informative session. I hope from the deliberations today and the presentations, we are equipped to go and contribute through our PAOs for comment letters to be submitted. Closing date for submission of comment letters is 1 December 2023. So we have just, we actually just have 29 days to work on our, 28 actually to work on our comment letters. So let's get our voices heard. We look forward to having all of us on this call participating in tomorrow's session. And as I've said, the energy has been going up since Monday. Tomorrow, the focus is on education. And this is where capacity issues to do with capacity building as we lead up to the rollout of the International Sustainability Reporting Standards and the assurance thereof. I think a comment which was made by David in his presentation, which I subscribe to, accountants can change the world, and together we can change the world. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing all of you tomorrow, and goodbye.